Good morning, everyone. My name is Monique Gignac. I'm a scientist here at the Institute for Work and Health. Welcome to the Institute's speaker series. I'm delighted to have with us today Dr. Faraz Vahid Shahidi. Before I introduce him, though, I'll just run through a couple of housekeeping issues with you. The presentation today will be recorded and the slides will be made available probably sometime next week, so you can get a copy of those. If you are interested in closed captioning, you will find that at the bottom of your screen under the More button, and you can activate that there. For questions, what we'll do is we'll wait until the end of the presentation, and if you have a question or a comment, and we hope you will participate, please type it into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. We often get a large number of questions because we tend to get a good number of people on our webinars. So what we'll do is I will try to answer as many as I can. If there are similar questions, I will group them together, but we absolutely recommend that you get in touch with our speakers if we aren't able to ask your question, if we run out of time today. So with that in mind, I will get us started right away. Again, my welcome to Dr. Faraz Vahid Shahidi, who is an associate scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. He's also an assistant professor in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Dr. Shahidi is a social epidemiologist by training, and his research aims to understand how societal conditions, such as the changing nature of work and employment, shape the health and safety of working people. Today, he's got a very interesting title for his presentation: Good Jobs, Bad Jobs, and Deaths of Despair. Over to you, Faraz.
Thank you, Monique. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you for giving us your time and for your interest in our work. As Monique mentioned, I'll be presenting today findings from a study that we recently published in which we looked at the relationship between quality of employment and deaths of despair, referring to deaths related to suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable causes. This study was led jointly by myself and PhD candidate, soon to be Dr. Alessandra Andriacci from the University of Toronto, as well as a number of colleagues and peers locally here at the Institute and from neighboring institutions, including Public Health Ontario and the Public Health Agency of Canada. A quick note that this study didn't receive direct funding from any source, but the Institute itself is supported through funding from the province of Ontario. And just keeping in mind, the sort of findings I'm presenting and the views I'm expressing today are those of myself and the study team, and not necessarily those of the province. If you'd like to learn more about this study, a publication that is available for free to read is online. There's a link here. Slides will be shared, as Monique mentioned, and I believe a link should either be in the chat right now or will shortly be shared with you in the chat. So, key messages. As you can imagine, if there's one thing I would love for you to walk away with today, it's an understanding that quality of employment matters. It matters in general for understanding health, and as I'll show today, it matters when it comes to understanding suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. In fact, workers in precarious employment, so these are the lowest quality jobs in our labor market, they appear to experience particularly high rates of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. And because of these linkages I'm going to talk about today, we walk away with another key message, which is that we think employment quality represents a potentially promising upstream intervention target for efforts to prevent suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable deaths. And that relatedly and ultimately, the focus of contemporary employment strategies and policy strategies should be to focus not only on creating more jobs, but on ensuring that the jobs we're creating in our economy are of good quality. So by way of background, The story behind this study starts with a finding that's reported not only in Canada, but in a number of other high-income countries as well. And that finding is stalling life expectancy. For decades, the number of years that Canadians were expected to live increased gradually year to year. But starting in around 2017, Statistics Canada reports that these life expectancy gains year over year are not only slowing down, but actually stalling. So life expectancy stops rising. As I mentioned, this trend predates the COVID-19 pandemic, although there's some evidence coming out again from StatsCan that these trends have worsened in recent years. But what we know is that they are in some part driven by a pattern of increasing suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. A good chunk of these increases are attributable to drug poisonings, and a large portion of those increases are attributable to what we call drug toxicity deaths related to opioids. But over and above that, we are also seeing in recent years small but non-negligible increases in rates of suicide and alcohol related mortality as well. So, suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable deaths are sometimes grouped together and labeled deaths of despair. The use of the term despair is meant to signal the fact that these deaths often, not always, but often share a common underlying cause: psychological distress. These distress or despair associated deaths have risen against the backdrop of some pretty significant changes in the sort of social and economic fabric of everyday life. And the most commonly cited sort of socioeconomic shifts are listed here on the slide. So, growing income inequality, a shrinking social safety net, deteriorating labor market conditions, and a prevailing hypothesis in the literature on deaths of despair states that these causes of death may be increasing because of these challenging social and economic conditions. Naturally, here at the Institute for Work and Health, the piece of that puzzle we were interested in picking up on is the piece around work and employment, the labor market. Why focus on work and employment? Well, deaths of despair are rising in the population in general, but evidence suggests that they are rising particularly quickly among working age adults. So these are adults who will spend a good portion of their time attached to the labor market, and for that reason, potentially may be sensitive to conditions in the labor market, including changes in the conditions of the labor market. Research also shows that employment, that is having a job as opposed to not having a job, is highly protective. It protects against psychological distress, and it protects against the distal downstream consequences of distress, including suicide and substance use. Um, and it's pretty intuitive why that might be the case. For many of us, most of us probably on this call, employment is a vital source not only of income, but also of other sort of resources and goods, status, meaning, connection. It's probably also intuitive to most of us on this call that not all jobs are created equal. And so not all forms of employment are going to be equally protective. In fact, some forms of employment, as it turns out, particularly those forms of employment that are insecure and unrewarding, they actually leave people vulnerable to varying extents to despair and its sort of downstream correlates like suicide and substance use related mortality. At present, we know quite little about how quality of employment, as opposed to the state of being employed versus unemployed, how quality of employment influences the risk of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable death. So, quickly, what do I mean exactly by quality of employment? Well, employment quality refers simply to those terms and conditions of a job that help us understand why work can be a positive or negative experience. So, employment is considered high quality, a positive experience when it enables people to meet their needs and pursue their goals. Sort of aspects of life that we know are important for well-being and mental health in particular. So key dimensions of employment quality include some of the ones I've listed here through a UN framework on quality of employment. Um, do you have a voice at work? Is your job stable and secure? Is it gainful, a living wage? How many hours do you work? Do you have any sort of fringe benefits? Are you part of the workplace pension program? Is work safe? Does work give you an opportunity to develop your skills and grow your career and so on? So all of these diverse multiple dimensions help people like me, researchers, but also others, decision makers, employers, advocates, to distinguish between good and bad jobs, jobs that do enable people to meet their needs and pursue their goals, and jobs that don't do as good of a job at those things. So, bringing all this together, in this study, we were interested in examining how the quality of a person's employment affects their risk of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. And we had two main objectives in that regard. First, we were interested in actually describing quality of employment in Canada. What do jobs look like in the labor market? Once we had identified distinct types of employment arrangements and how they vary in terms of quality, we then looked at how they predict a person's risk of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. So just a few slides to tell you a little bit about how we conducted the study, starting with our data sources. So we had two main data sources, the Canadian Census Health and Environment Cohort, also known as the CanCheck. This is a nationally representative cohort of 6 million Canadians who were selected at random to complete the mandatory long-form census in 2006. Now, we linked these 6 million census respondents, long-form census respondents, to a health database, and a particular aspect of that database called the Vital Statistics Death Database. And this is simply a database of all deaths recorded in Canada. So we linked census records from the 2006 CanCheck cohort to a database of death records over a 13-year sort of observation window from 2006 until the end of 2019. The study sample included 2.8 million workers. So how did we go from 6 million census respondents to 2.8 million workers? Well, because we were interested in quality of employment, naturally, there had to be some inclusion and exclusion criteria. So in order to be included in the study, you had to be an adult who was 18 to 64 years old, so of working age. And you also had to be active in the labor force. So either in paid employment or unemployed and actively seeking opportunities for paid employment. Excluded from the sample were people who were not active in the labor force. Maybe they were retired, maybe they were in full-time school and not working. You can think of other reasons as well why people might not be in the labor force. So they're neither employed nor are they seeking paid employment. There were also a couple of other groups who were lacking information on quality of employment, and so they were also excluded from the study. And ultimately, what we landed with was 2.8 million workers. We assessed employment quality according to three indicators that are available in the census. Stability is an indicator capturing the number of weeks a person worked during the previous year. Hours refers to the number of hours that person usually worked when they were employed. And earnings specifically captures personal income from wages, salaries, tips, or commissions during the previous year. You may be wondering how I went from telling you that quality of employment is this multidimensional, diverse construct, lots of dimensions feeding into it. And then on this slide told you we were able to look at stability, hours, and earnings. So this is a persisting challenge for work and health researchers in Canada, where the data that is best suitable for studying outcomes like death and mortality are not always the same data sets that provide the sort of most comprehensive picture of people's work and employment arrangements. We would have loved to look at benefit coverage? How much autonomy do you have at work? Do you find your work meaningful? We would have loved to include these indicators, but they are not measured in the census. So we did the best we could with the measures that are available in the census. How stable is your work? How many hours do you work? And how gainful is your employment? And I'll talk a little bit more about this limitation at the back end of the presentation. We assessed cause of death using internationally recognized and standardized codes called ICD-10 codes. Um, so for suicide and drug poisoning deaths, we used ICD-10 codes that are consistent with those used by Statistics Canada for identifying suicide and drug poisonings. And for alcohol attributable deaths, we focused on a series of about 14 causes that are thought to be, 13 causes of death, rather, that are thought to be entirely attributable to alcohol. And these ICD-10 codes were used in a manner consistent with the Canadian Institute for Health Information. We used a statistical technique called latent class analysis to group workers according to the quality of their employment. These groups are known as latent classes, and each latent class in our study essentially represents a distinct type of employment. And some types of employment are higher in quality, and some types of employment are lower in quality. Once we used latent class analysis to identify these distinct types of employment, we then used pretty standard regression models in order to examine the statistical relationship between falling in one type of employment and subsequent risk of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality, specifically over a period of 13 years. These regression models were stratified by sex, and they were also statistically adjusted to account for the role that age, race, immigration status, education, and so on the role they might play in explaining both a person's employment quality and their risk of mortality. So we wanted to rule out the effect of age, education, and so on in order to do our best attempt at isolating specifically the impact of employment quality on a person's risk of despair-associated mortality. Now, I mentioned earlier that these three causes tend to move together in the population, but there are also important reasons not to simply collapse them and flatten them out into a single outcome. So instead, we did look at them separately as three distinct outcomes in three separate models. So moving on to results, and I'll start with just a descriptive overview of the employment types that we found, the latent classes that we uncovered, that we identified. So in our sample of labor force active workers, we identified 5 overarching types of employment. And part of what distinguished these different types of employment is that they varied considerably in terms of employment quality. So the largest group of workers, comprised of roughly about 44% of our sample, they reported stable employment, full-time hours, and relatively high earnings. And given that this was the largest group, and also describing a type of employment arrangement that for most people, not all people, but for most people represents a kind of gold standard, 40 hours a week, gainful wages, stability and security. We ascribe the label standard to this group. So this is standard employment. Alongside this standard employment, we found a somewhat smaller group, also high quality, but it was distinguished by a combination of very long hours, so 49 or more hours a week, in exchange, presumably, for very high earnings. And we call this long hours, very high earnings group portfolio employment. Closer to the lower end of the employment quality spectrum, or we might say the intermediate range, we have a group of workers in stable employment, but reporting low hours and low earnings. And given that these are sort of indicative of a somewhat attached but somewhat detached from the labor market, we labeled this group marginal employment. Next, there was a group of people who were reporting long hours, decent earnings, but what distinguished them is that they appear to, at some point during the preceding year, have experienced either some sort of voluntary job separation or involuntary job loss. So some instability in their employment. And so, given the sort of seemingly sporadic and intermittent nature of their employment, we assign the label intermittent to this group. Finally, the smallest, but not necessarily the least sort of consequential or important group was a group of workers who reported the worst conditions along all three of the dimensions. So the least stable employment, the lowest hours, and the lowest earnings. And we referred to this sort of lowest quality employment group precarious employment, and it represented a little over 1 in 10 workers. Given the size and the gold standardness of the standard employment group, again, not for everybody, but for many people, we used standard employment as a point of reference in our study. So we asked, for instance, how does each group compare to standard employment or to workers in standard employment? And what we found descriptively is that workers in lower quality employment were more likely to be women, younger, and identify with a non-white race or ethnicity. So just by way of example, about a quarter of workers in portfolio employment were women. But this reached 55% and 65% women in marginal and precarious employment. So a larger share of workers in marginal and precarious employment were women. With respect to age, about a quarter of workers in standard and portfolio higher quality employment were younger, whereas this group of 18 to 34-year-olds, younger workers, represented 60% of the precariously employed sample. And finally, 15 and 16% of workers in standard and portfolio employment identified with a non-white race or ethnicity, and that reached up to a quarter of workers in precarious employment. Also, at a descriptive level, we found that workers in lower quality employment experienced higher rates of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. So what you see here is that as we move from the higher quality good jobs towards the lower quality employment arrangements, marginal, then intermittent, and then precarious, the lowest quality, you see this overall trend towards increasing rates of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. Um, Not perfectly sort of symmetrical, not identical across the outcomes, but in general, bird's eye view, this kind of gradient, increasing rates of death as you move down the spectrum of employment quality towards the lower quality employment arrangements. Pardon me before I move forward. I mentioned that we were interested in modeling these relationships statistically. So we used regression analyses to do that. I mentioned wanting to do that by sex, so distinguishing men and women in the labor market. And I also mentioned wanting to rule out the effect of things like age, sex, education, race, ethnicity, those differences, those underlying differences in these groups, some of which I covered in the previous slide. We wanted to statistically rule them out as explanations to really do the best we could at isolating the impact of employment quality on our outcomes. And so we did that again separately for suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. And there's sort of a lot that I could have presented today, but what I've opted to do is sort of highlight 2 or 3 of the findings we think are most important and most notable for each of the 3 outcomes. And there will be some consistency across the 3 outcomes. Jumping into the first one, suicide. So in our regression models, we found that workers in precarious employment were about twice as likely to die by suicide relative to workers in standard employment. So that's depicted here visually using point estimates plotted where a value larger than 1 means that the group is more likely to have experienced the outcome, so suicide, relative to the reference group of workers in standard employment. So you'll see that precariously employed women were about 2.4 times as likely to experience suicide, while precariously employed men were about 1.7 times more likely to experience suicide. Other groups relative to standard employment also showed elevated risks. But on this slide, what I'm doing is drawing your attention to the example of precarious employment. Now, another notable observation about the relationships I'm showing on this slide with respect to suicide is that differences weren't as stark among men. So the relative disadvantage associated with marginal employment, associated with precarious employment, associated with portfolio, the disadvantage with respect to experiences of suicide were not as large for men as for women. But keep in mind that at a baseline level, rates of suicide are higher among men. So while the relative disadvantage associated with, say, precarious employment isn't as large among men, it does represent a larger absolute number of cases or events of suicide. But we wanted to draw your attention to the somewhat weaker associations among men. And just by way of example, portfolio employment, which you may remember, long hours in exchange for very high earnings, was associated with an elevated risk of suicide among women, about 50% greater risk, but not so much among men. So just one example of these sex differences that we noted. Moving on to drug poisonings, workers in precarious employment were about 3 times as likely to experience a fatal drug poisoning. So, precariously employed women, about 3.6 times as likely, and precariously employed men, about 2.7 times as likely, roughly averaging out to about a threefold risk of fatal drug poisoning among precariously employed workers. For this outcome, we also found that intermittent employment, so that was the sporadic, somewhat unstable employment arrangements, indicative of, say, seasonal or regular or short-term contract work. It was also associated with a nearly threefold risk of fatal drug poisoning, so a little greater than 3 among women and about 2.4 times the risk among men associated with intermittent employment. Once again, these associations were somewhat less pronounced among men relative to women, although here, in general, the sort of takeaway is quite a large and steep gradient in risk associated with employment quality among men and women alike. Finally, for alcohol attributable deaths, we found that workers in precarious employment were about twice as likely to experience alcohol attributable mortality. So 1.8 fold risk among precariously employed women relative to women in standard employment. And among precariously employed men, a risk about 2.2 times greater than men in standard employment. You'll notice that here things shifted a little bit, and differences this time were not as stark among women. In fact, aside from precarious employment, employment quality wasn't much of a meaningful predictor of alcohol attributable mortality among women. So portfolio and marginal employment isn't showing that gradient here. It's not part of a gradient of risk increasing towards precarious employment. A little bit of a signal for intermittent, but in general, in contrast to men, not much of a gradient effect. It's really precarious employment among women that's standing out for us when it comes to understanding or at least predicting alcohol attributable mortality. So, with the time we have left, what I want to do is summarize what I presented on the previous 12 slides of results and just tell you, move away from the fine-grained view and towards, again, like bird's eye view of what we think are the most important findings. I want to tell you a little bit about what we think are the sort of key strengths and key limitations of our study. And finally, I want to reiterate what we feel are the key takeaways, the most important messages that we think and would love for you to walk away with today. So to summarize the findings, we identified 5 distinct types of employment. And we labeled these different types of employment roughly in order of decreasing quality: standard, portfolio, marginal, intermittent, and precarious respectively. We observed a mortality gradient across these different employment arrangements, such that lower quality employment in general and precarious employment in particular predicted a higher risk of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable death relative to their counterparts in standard employment, in those 40-hour-a-week stable, gainful earnings employment arrangements. Workers in the lowest quality jobs, precarious employment, were 2 to 3 times more likely to experience deaths of despair. We also wanted to sort of reiterate that these associations varied in important ways by sex, and they often varied in such a way that associations were stronger among women. And the reason we think this is notable in its own right, but doubly so because in the work and health research world, we tend to find actually that men are more sensitive to labor market conditions and the health effects of labor market conditions. That didn't really sort of apply consistently in our study, where instead it seemed that women, at least when it comes to suicide and drug poisoning, seem to show greater effects associated with employment quality compared to men. So key strengths of our study include the fact that we were able to use a large and nationally representative cohort. It is not often that you get to work with millions of workers in terms of a data set. So that was a really notable strength. We also had a long follow-up period. So we were able to assess risk of death over 13 years. And that's sort of necessary for studying cause-specific deaths and then separately for men and women, for example. So you need to follow people for a long enough time to observe enough events to occur so that you can statistically model those events. Another sort of key conceptual strength of the study is that what we think, is encourage people to think not only about employment status as a risk factor, do you have a job or not, but to start thinking a bit more about what happens when people are in employment. So employment quality, not do you have a job, but what kind of job do you have? What quality job? Key limitations include the fact that we only assessed each person's quality of employment at one point in time in 2006. And 2006, as we all know, nearly 2 decades ago. A lot has happened since 2006, the Great Recession, the pandemic, so on. What we think this means is probably that the relative share of workers who fall into one or another of the 5 types of employment has probably shifted over time. Less likely, we think, is that an entirely new type of employment has emerged. There might be one exception to that you might be thinking of, which is the sort of digital platform work, gig work. We aren't able to tell you much about that using our pretty much nothing, really, unfortunately, with our 2006 data. But in general, what we think is that what's happened over 2 decades is probably the size of each group has shifted. But not necessarily how it associates or predicts suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality. I also mentioned that we were missing some key dimensions of work. We would have loved to be able to tell you something about each of these groups with respect to whether they had access to a workplace pension program, whether they experienced decision latitude at work, how much autonomy do they have, what kind of meaning do they derive from their work. And this isn't just important in terms of describing employment, which we would have loved to be able to do, but it also might have clued us into some of the underlying mechanisms that link certain types of employment arrangements to suicide and substance use. So lack of meaning, lack of autonomy, and the stress associated with those conditions. Finally, we can't rule out reverse causation. Of course, here I don't mean the effect of death on the quality of your employment. What I mean is within the work and health research world, we know that employment is a determinant of health and that health is also a determinant of employment. It is possible that for some people, experiencing physical or mental health problems creates barriers to higher quality employment and unfortunately drives people into lower quality, including precarious jobs. And for reasons completely unrelated to those jobs, they may experience elevated risks of suicide and substance use. So we can't sort of tease apart these processes, but sort of results I've presented indicate very strong signals. And so we do feel a good chunk of what it is we're reporting here is very likely to be the causal effect of employment quality on outcomes. Not all of it, but a good chunk of it, just given the sheer size of the signal. So by way of conclusion, just to reiterate what we think are some key messages for you to walk away with. So when it comes to understanding the patterns of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality, including potentially why they are increasing over time, quality of employment matters. It's an important part of the story, and we would encourage people to attend to that part of the story. Workers in precarious employment in particular experience high rates of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality, although there is a gradient across these employment quality groups. Given the sheer size of the signal, these associations between employment quality and deaths of despair, we think that employment quality represents a promising upstream intervention target to help prevent suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable deaths. And ultimately, by way of reminder, our employment strategies and our policy strategies today should focus not only on crafting or creating more jobs, but also naturally on ensuring that the jobs we do create are of good quality. They enable people to meet their needs and pursue their goals in life. And that's it for me. Thanks so much for your time. Happy to answer questions. Sorry, buddy.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Faraz. That was a really fascinating presentation. We do have a number of questions already, and if you are interested in asking a question, please type it into the Q&A box. We'll do our best. We have about 15-20 minutes to get through some questions. If I'm not able to get to your question, I apologize, but please do reach out to Faraz and ask him directly, and he'd be happy to answer everything. So let's get started for us. Again, thank you very much. A couple questions that are kind of coming in about the slide you noted around men not having as much differentiation in suicide related to the quality of work. And wondering if you have some thoughts about what might be going on there. And in particular, we have some questions, people wondering about differences in the types of jobs that men may have themselves that may contribute to something like suicide. Post-traumatic stress injuries or other types of injuries, or being a first responder, sort of certain sectors where the type of work men are engaged in may be stable and full-time hours, but it's the work itself. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and context and detail that was shared with the question is exactly kind of where we went as a group. You'll remember these are relative effects. So in each group relative to men, for example, in standard employment. And if men in general, and I think this was, if I understood correctly, this was hinted at in the question, the way you articulated it, Monique. If men in so-called standard employment in general are employed in jobs where they're and for other reasons, non-work related reasons, as well as work related reasons, experience high rates of suicide, then the relative difference between groups are not going to be as stark. So by contrast, if women in standard employment, due to work and non-work related factors, experience very low rates of suicide, which they do, then these relative differences by employment quality are going to stand out the way they do somewhat in a slide like this. And so that is, we agree, that is absolutely one of the factors that could be explaining why these relative differences look somewhat smaller among men, despite the fact that they account for a very large share of events related to self-harm because of those higher baseline rates among men, including men in our reference group, standard employment.
And do you have, for future research, access to more information about job title and sort of specifics about the job? Like, could you link this with injury data, for example, or other like WSIB data or something like that
Yeah.
in the future? I know it's already complicated enough.
Yeah, no, that would be really neat. So less likely to happen is a linkage with sort of, for example, claims. Less likely. What's much more likely, including with help from colleagues here at the Institute, including a number of colleagues here at the Institute, what's more likely is sort of diving deeper into the occupational characteristics of these groups. So I'm describing sort of how stable is your employment, how many hours did you work, but there's all sorts of other aspects of an occupation that we can dive into using job titles that are collected in the census, and that's why it's much more likely. So in the census, we have information on what your job title is, and based on that, we can start in future research to narrow in on certain aspects of like certain occupational characteristics that might increase a person's risk, for example, of PTSD or of work injury and things like that. So absolutely, that is on our radar, and the radar of others at the Institute.
Okay, thank you. You had noted some findings with younger workers in terms of being more in precarious roles, and we have someone who's interested though in the fact that we have working seniors as a bigger group that's growing, and whether or not their work quality is different than other older workers. And were you able to kind of include some of these people in
Yeah.
your study?
So we looked at adults 18 to 64. It's a convention in the literature. It doesn't mean it's the only way of conducting a study like this, but it's a convention in the literature, and that's how we approached it, which means, if, for example, we're talking about 65 and above senior workers, they would not be included in this study. What I will mention, though, probably the most notable finding with respect to older workers, I didn't cover it today, but since the questions come up, I'll share it. The most notable finding when it came to older workers, particularly those in the lower quality jobs, precarious, marginal, we found that the strength of the association between the quality of your employment and your risk of suicide, drug poisoning, and alcohol attributable mortality was considerably higher among older workers relative to younger workers. And our going assumption for why that's the case is that it's possible that when you're younger, falling into a lower quality job is a less strong, less indicative signal of the course of your next 30 years or 40 years in the labor market. And by contrast, if you are an older worker in a precarious or marginal employment situation, it may in fact reflect 20, 30, 40 years of cumulative labor market disadvantage. And that might explain why, yeah, that key finding that I didn't talk about in the presentation, but that key finding where these associations tended to be stronger, worse for older workers.
Okay, thank you very much. Were you able to control for things like past diseases, hospital visits, rehab, anything like that in the study?
No, and we were not, unfortunately, able to do that. And that is exactly why we think it is reasonable and fair to think that part of the signal we registered may reflect the fact that pre-existing health problems disadvantage people, create barriers in the labor market, and might explain some of the reason why workers in the lower quality employment groups experience these heightened risks of death. So that's exactly what that question is getting at. Because we couldn't control for those underlying pre-existing disparities in health status, we can't rule them out as a kind of, if not competing, then parallel explanation for this association between quality of employment and mortality.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned gig workers, that this is something new. Using your classification scheme, would gig workers fall into one of the kind of quality of employment groups, or do you think they belong in a new group that would be somewhat different?
I think I'm being invited to speculate, but I
Just
will do
yes,
my yes,
absolutely.
I will do my best at like educated speculation. So I will suggest that probably what we would find, given the limited indicators we had in the census, rather than a separate group entirely, gig workers, we would probably see them appear in a combination of marginal and precarious employment. So often lower hours, often lower earnings, potentially often also moving job to job in that sense of gig work. And so the marginal, the precarious, that's an educated guess, but I can tell you in the same way it's probably on the radar of many of the those in the room today. It is absolutely on our radar as well to try to move beyond 2006 and get a sense of what the labor market looks today, including when it comes to capturing gig workers and understanding the health effects of gig work.
Thank you as well. I'm trying to actually blend a couple of questions here. In terms of going forward, you had a nice model that talked about the quality of work, went beyond structural aspects like pay and hours and so on to these more subjective experiences. So is there or are there any data that would provide some of that could be linked? And if not, I'm going to make this a two-part question. What would you wish for if you were to be able to add any kind of additional questions to any of the existing data?
Yeah, great question. So, um, good news is that there are other surveys out there, also conducted, administered by Statistics Canada. So, really good quality data, large-ish and representative samples, which is really important, that do collect information on a broader suite of work and employment characteristics. Even both objective and subjective elements, for example. So it's one thing to ask, are you on a permanent contract? It's another thing to ask a person, how secure do you feel in that permanent? So, even surveys that ask about skill match. Are you overqualified or underqualified for your job? Are you unionized? Are you able to express yourself at work? And so the surveys are out there. Bad news is, and I kind of alluded to this maybe a couple slides from here, is that those are the surveys that do a wonderful job with help from Statistics Canada, a wonderful job of describing people's work and employment conditions, but they are not linked and generally not linkable, not meaningfully linkable to administrative health data, including things like death records, the kind of linkage we need in order to tell you something about how certain types of jobs are associated with risk of death and cause-specific death. So at the Institute, we are using these other surveys to get a better handle on job quality, looking at a broader suite of factors, getting a bit more of a recent picture as well, because we no longer have to work with 2006 data. We can work with more recent data. Um, and so we are doing that, and we are looking at how those other aspects of jobs are related to things like mental health, wellness, well-being. Going so far as to look at death and cause-specific death, bad news is probably not possible with those other surveys, because while they do a great job of telling us about jobs, they can't really be linked to things like death records.
Can you give us a little bit more detail then, or any new findings coming out from some of those studies that would be of interest? And by the way, I want to just note lots of compliments coming in, and thank you about the presentation and how interesting and fascinating it was. So I'll just mention that and then I'll ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, maybe by way of example, because we are working on those data sets, Monique, as you know. So maybe by way of example, I can tell you about a group that appears in those survey data that didn't appear in this census data. It's a group that we call flexicure workers. And we call them flexicure workers because they benefit from a combination of sort of flexibility in the employment relationship with all sorts of functional substitutes in terms of security. So these are not unionized workers. These are not workers who report being sort of so well attached to their employer that they have a pension plan, they're part of a pension plan. Many of them work sort of non-standard hours. Some of them work on temporary contracts. But because we have other variables in these other data sets, what we're uncovering about this group is that they are reporting some of the highest, in fact, generally the highest rates of skill growth. I feel that I'm growing. I feel I have opportunities to develop in my field. Um, nobody describing overqualification, quite the opposite. I'm really well matched to this job. So that's just one. I don't want to take up too much time, but that's just
Mhm.
a flavor of what we're uncovering in these other data sets where we have indicators like opportunities for training, opportunities for growth, skill match. We are uncovering some neat groups of people who deviate somewhat from this typology precisely because we're able to ask people in those surveys about things like training, development, skill match, and things like that.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll try and get in a couple more
Okay.
questions. So this is a more methodological question, so I'm going to read it.
Okay.
I understand that you first established that genders and ethnicities varied by group. Then you looked at rates by gender and group. What about intra-class confounding, where, for example, female precarious workers are more precarious than their male counterparts? Um, does the same, so can you just comment on that?
Yes. Yes.
Um,
So in any sort of study like this, where we're trying to, or you or a researcher is trying to create a classification of jobs, there's one, among other, important analytic decision that you need to make as a researcher or a team of researchers. Do you want to create one classification and ask, for example, whether women are more likely to fall in one aspect of the classification than another? Or do you want to make a quite separate and fundamentally different analytic decision and say, I want to create a classification of women's employment and a separate classification of men's employment? Um, Kind of a perennial problem in this literature. We opted for what I would say is more common, and in that sense, better approximate sort of going convention. And so going convention is create a single classification so that you can say, are women more likely to be in one sort of pocket of this classification, and less likely possibly than men to fall in other pockets of this classification? That becomes a little harder to do when you create an entirely separate classification for men and women. Strengths and benefits to both approaches. We didn't take that latter approach, so I can't comment on it. But I do want to provide the person who asked the question and others in the audience. That's the sort of rationale. A common typology so that we can directly say within this sample of men and women, are they distributed similarly or dissimilarly across the groups?
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Sorry, I didn't get to all of the questions, but we got through quite
Probably
a
my
few of
fault.
them. No, we got through quite a few of them. Are there any early signals to these deaths of despair that maybe we can pick up on? Thinking back also to some of those policy implications. So, is it possible to look at whether depression or burnout or certain kinds of health conditions may be precursors to these for perhaps earlier intervention?
That's a great question. And that's, I think, in fact, that is how we, for those who want to take a closer peek at the publication, we talk about these precursors, these often, not always, but often mental health related precursors. There's plenty of work out there. Didn't have time to talk about it, but there's plenty of work out there talking about how, aspects of job security and precarity and so on predict these precursors of suicide and substance use related mortality. And this is naturally a next sort of question. If we know that distally, downstream, there are these sort of ultimate definite consequences like premature death, a natural next question is for us to start understanding the intermediary mechanisms. Many of them are likely to be these mental health related precursors. And so, just to provide one example of how we might do that as a next step, is to look not at the death records in this health administrative database that the census is linked to, but to look at earlier signals, precursor signals in terms of hospitalizations. So hospitalizations related to despair is a term you may see in some studies. So natural next question, it's a great question to ask me. Didn't dive into that in this study, but it is exactly where one would want to go to understand what those early signals and intermediating sort of mechanisms are linking employment quality down the line over up to 13 years, premature death.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other policy specific recommendations that you have? And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say recommendations,
Right.
no. And part of the reason for that is when we recommend policies, we want to make sure that they work. And in our study, we didn't ask we didn't simulate what would this policy or that policy do either to quality of employment or to deaths of despair. But in general, what we think our contribution with this study is to essentially just reinforce the chorus of many stakeholders, right, in government, in workplaces, in research, that are sort of forming this choir, just like reiterating and reinforcing that, yes, we need to make sure jobs are available. But on top of that, in complement to that, we need to make sure that the jobs that are available really help people meet their needs and pursue their goals. And there are various levers, including policy levers, for doing that. We just didn't examine them in this study, and I would hate to speculate, but we are on the case, and many other researchers are also on the case in terms of trying to figure out what those interventions are, those policy levers are, both to improve quality of jobs and quality of employment and improve population health.
Okay, I think that's actually a perfect statement to finish the speaker series off with today. I want to thank you again for a really excellent presentation. Again, lots of positive feedback coming in throughout the talk. And thank you all for attending. And I hope you'll come join us again next month on May 27th. We have Dr. Emil Tompa speaking, and he'll be talking about preventing PTSI work disability at first responder organizations, an environmental scan. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you.